Let's talk about that. Each week, Washington State University presents a discussion of the issues and topics of concern to Americans in the Pacific Northwest. Your host and moderator for Let's Talk About That is Bert Harrison of WSU's Communications Department. Professor Harrison's guests this week are Frederick Duman and George Mosse. They will discuss Nazism or nationalism in Germany. Here to introduce his guests is Bert Harrison.
It seems a long time since we watched those movies of the stormtroopers and gasped in horror at the swastika armbands and the goose-stepping bully boys. Nazism, after 22 years, has seemed safely dead. Crops up only in such generally laughable movements as George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party. But there are those observers of Germany who insist that Nazism still lies just under the surface of the German state and the German mind, that the crooked cross and all it implies are still a long way from being buried from all times. You particularly hear this fear expressed since the Kurt George Kiesinger regime took over in Bonn, for Chancellor Kiesinger was a long-time member of the party. At any rate, on this edition of our program, we're going to examine the resurgence of German Nazism, if there is such. Our panel members are two historians, both primarily interested in contemporary history. Professor George L. Mosse is one of the nation's most distinguished historians. Dr. Mosse is Bascom Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin. He's the author of many books and articles, including The Culture of Western Europe and The Crisis of German Ideology. He's currently on the Washington State University campus as a visiting lecturer for the honors program. Professor Fred Duman is on the WSU history faculty. Dr. Duman's specialty is 20th century history. He's done considerable work on the Nazi period in Germany. He's made an intensive study of the German war records from World War II for the National Archives and the American Historical Association. And I understand, Fred, that you're about to go to Vienna to tackle the same thing on the Austrian War Archives.
Yes. Actually, the earlier period, but that's...
Well, I'm going to throw the ball to start to the visiting dignitary. George, when you think of Nazism and neo-Nazism, to a member of my generation at least, you think of the mustache and the stormtroopers and the big mass demonstrations. Is this what we imply when we talk about a resurgence of the Nazi Party?
Well, I think we must get it straight in a historical perspective. No nation exists in the world today, for better or worse, without a nationalist party. And all that has really happened in Germany, from one point of view, is that Germany is going back to normal. After the war, National Socialism discredited all nationalism, and now, what is it, 20 years later, over 20 years later, you have the resurgence of a nationalism and the formation of a nationalist party. I think that was only to be expected. It is certainly not a Nazi party as you think of it, because history does not repeat itself. It is more a conservative party in the tradition of German conservatism, which was always, at least in part, racist, in part against everything foreign, which this party is as well. Mm-hmm. In fact, the program of this party, the DNP, Deutsche Nationalpartei, is very startlingly like the program of the old German Nationalist Party, which went into a coalition with Hitler for a year, but was then squashed by Hitler in turn. It's very similar.
Including some of the trappings, it seems to me I've read that the old saber scars are very big again, aren't they? And
well, that came in a long time ago. That started, as a matter of fact, with the Catholic fraternities in 1953 under the protection of the Adenauer regime, and that dueling and the whole fraternity system has been with us in Germany for 15 years. Hasn't changed.
But that, right, too, is an aspect of the recurrence or the redevelopment or the rehabilitation of respectable nationalism, at least respectable within its own environment, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Well, now you, gentlemen, it seems to me, are fairly careful, though, to... You say history does not repeat itself, and yet I would gather that this resurgent nationalism in Germany does have a great many of the... does it have the same underlying ideology, you feel?
Well, German nationalism is German nationalism, and you may not like it, and I may not like it, but there it is. Yes, it orients itself towards blood and soil to a certain extent. All German nationalism will. This cannot be denied. It is racist to a certain extent, though there are, of course, hardly any Jews to be racist about. It is against the East, obviously. German nationalism has always been directed against the East, and now that it's the communist East, it makes that still a great deal easier. What I'm really saying is that this is a resurgence of German nationalism, and none of us like German nationalism, but there it is, and it's that which is coming up.
Well, one of the similarities, I would believe, and I think maybe Mr. Mossy would agree with this, is in some of the problems which the modern recent nationalists of Germany face or try to deal with, and some that the Nazis thrived on. The fact that Germany is disunited after World War I, of course, it was the matter of having lost honor and having lost territory as a result of World War I and the peace settlement. Today it's the matter of division of Germany and the loss of considerable territory to Poland and Russia, outright annexation by those two countries. So this would be an ingredient. Even though the matter of German military honor is probably not as important at this point as it was after World War I, one does hear these comments concerning the fact that the German army was not really defeated in World War II. It was just overwhelming numbers. And then the racist aspect. Today, of course, as Mr. Mossy mentioned, it's not the Jews so much because there are only, I don't think, more than 5,000 or 10,000 in all of Germany, something like that. Today it's the foreign worker. And the Germans, who probably are more critical of this new nationalism than anybody else outside of Germany. The Germans themselves, the German critics, have emphasized this and have pointed to this particular problem, and the fact that the Fremdarbeiter, as the Germans call him, the foreign worker, is pretty much taking the place of the Jew.
Now, these are all people who, what, have come into Germany under the common market
yes, workers from all over Europe, and as a matter of fact, the Germans have several thousand Koreans even working in the mines.
But there's another factor which I would myself weigh even more heavily. If you look at the actual election returns for this party, one thing stands out. They come in certain regions of Germany which have certain special problems. And indeed, these election returns show that the party's strength is where it has always been since the 1880s and 1890s. Let me give one example. The strongest showing of the party was made in Franconia. This is Julius Streicher country. This is old Nazi country. And why? This is the Protestant minority in Catholic Bavaria. And it is also a rather impoverished rural region, by and large. Similarly, you have it in near the Rhine, where they made a very good showing, where conservative, extremist conservatism has made a good showing for 100 years, an impoverished agricultural belt. So that these regional factors are, I think, of extreme importance. The election that's coming up in Schleswig-Holstein, the party will show up very well. Schleswig-Holstein, again, an impoverished rural region with a long tradition of rural unrest, has always been extremist conservative. I think it will show up very well there. And then, of course, National Socialist.
As Mr. Mossy pointed out, Germany is returning to a certain extent to normal by having the reappearance and the rehabilitation of nationalism. Now, the Germans complain very loudly about the fact that the Americans in particular, but foreigners in general, overemphasize the reappearance of this nationalism. And obviously, as long as people remember the era 1933 to 45, even a moderate form of nationalism in Germany is going to make hair stand on end outside of Germany. But I think the better way of putting it, or the better term of is here merely nationalism, or maybe even extreme nationalism. And if we take this country, we have certain similar such groups, which I think would fall basically into the same category, and which have very much in common and like each other very much.
Mm-hmm. However, so far in this country, we have been, these groups have never really been in a position to seize power, which I think...
No, but of course this is due to the fact, due to the party structure here, which makes any third party really quite difficult to
I can't quite
mature.
agree with this. I think Mr. Goldwater was very close to these groups in his outlook, much closer than one would perhaps like to have it. I do think that Mr. Goldwater and the DNP, their programs, they would agree with each other to a very large degree. I think there is a wing of the Republican Party in this country, and of course in the South a wing of the Democratic Party in this country, which is extremely close to these ideas, extremely close. so that one cannot really say that they don't take over. But what you can say is that there are enough counter-forces in this nation that they could never really take over in the way, let us say, you could take over in Germany. But there is very little doubt that the German Nationalist Party program is very like the program of many Southern Democrats and very like the program of the Goldwater wing of the Republican Party. I remember one phrase from that program which typifies it. In these days where our youth is finally waking up and making a little row as it should about our society, the program of the German Nationalist Party has this wonderful phrase in it: youth should enjoy itself and stick to sports. Well, this could come from Goldwater republicanism or Southern Democrats just as well. It typifies this whole attitude.
Fred, I'm going to buck that one right over to you.
Well, I was thinking of one particular party here in this country, and the so-called Conservative Party, and in one particular congressional district in this state, that party carried something like 7.2%, I think, of the vote in the for the congressional position in the '66 election. 7.2%, and that is almost exactly the percentage which was carried by the German Nationalist Party in the state of Hesse. And of course nobody said anything about this here because obviously the party system is such that this will not make it possible for that party to have any influence in Congress. Whereas since the same election occurred on the state level for state representation in Hesse, of course, it did carry some seats.
But if you look at the kind of militarism and activism that's involved in German nationalism and therefore in this party, then of course you can say, well, large sections of the Republican and Democratic Party these days share such concepts. I mean, the concept that what today Senator Dirksen said, let's go and fight, let's go and win. This kind of imperialism is in America in a way displaced to part of the outside world. In Germany, where can it be displaced to? Germany is no longer a major power. I do think you have to look at this German nationalism as a sign of frustration. And if you look at it in that light, it isn't as minor a phenomena as electoral figures. Electoral figures don't show much in any case. The Nazis had electoral strength very late in the day, but there were an awfully lot more Nazis than showed in their electoral strength because it was a movement of youth and they didn't vote yet. So that I would say that this party is much more serious, for it typifies, in a sense, a frustration. And once Germans become frustrated, they will turn to that kind of nationalism.
Well, now, wasn't this what we used to say
easier.
back in the 30s, that it was frustration, the German frustration, which led to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime?
Well, there's a certain truth to this, but on the other hand, it has now, I think, been proved out that when you have a very prosperous society, a very satisfied society, as it was in Germany, no doubt, for the last 10 years, then these phenomena are underground. I think scratch any German and you will find this kind of nationalism coming through, with large exceptions, the socialists, for example. But even here, I would say, this can be disputed. Frustration brings it to the foreground. It breaks through. Now, you can't also make the point that we've been making, in a way, that the DNP is isolated, because, again here, vast sections of the Christian Democrats are very close to the DNP. Especially the so-called refugee movements, those who were driven out of the Sudetenland and the Eastern Territories after the war. Now, old gentlemen, to be sure, most of them, but they're very close. So that actually, again, the party is just the peak of an iceberg. That we must not forget.
Now, the point you made a moment ago about the existence of very substantial counterforces here in this country, which would, to a considerable extent, negate or neutralize the extremism. I would believe, or I do believe, that if we compare Germany prior to 1933 and Germany today, that today we would have a considerably larger portion of the population, which would also be a counterforce and an active counterforce. I believe there'd be far more Germans today who'd be willing to, if necessary, go out in the street and oppose some form of extremism, of dictatorship, maybe still not the majority.
Well, I would agree with that, but I think the word extremism is misleading, because what we're really saying is that there are great forces in America and Germany who are against any extremism, in other words, who are middle-of-the-road liberal forces. Fine, as long as things go well. But if the German economic crisis deepens, as it well may, if in the United States foreign affairs and wars induce deeper and deeper frustrations, then the idea of extremism is really a meaningless idea. Because by using this word, what you're really saying is that the middle of the road is the thing. The middle of the road is the thing, and successful only if things are going well. If things are going badly, everybody becomes an extremist. It just depends what extremism you have. And I would make a guess that if America turned extremist, the United States, it would turn extremist to the right. And I am not as sanguine as you are, apparently, that this may not happen.
Well, no, I wouldn't. I'm not saying that this would not happen, but I do believe, and I would say that there are far more people in Germany today who are not just intellectually but emotionally attached to the democratic parliamentary process, and who would continue to work within the existing system to prevent the establishment of a dictatorial state of any kind.
Yes, that of course depends how the dictatorial state comes into being. It doesn't have to be a one-man dictatorship.
No.
You can say right now in Germany, with the coalition between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, you have a kind of situation where you have a regime which I am all in favor of for Germany, but which is in a way blanketing all opposition to it. Now, I do want to say, because you said that in the introduction, that Mr. Kiesinger's past is his past. It was never as National Socialist as it made out. I think that of all the possible candidates, he was probably the best, and that he is, in reality, now at any rate, a good Württemberg Democrat, and Democrat with a small d. And I want to point out to you that the German state of Württemberg has a parliamentary tradition older than the English parliamentary tradition. So that I don't think that the present regime is in any way tainted with Nazism. It's less tainted than the Adenauer regime was, which always had former Nazis, leading Nazis, in its cabinet. So it's less tainted with that. But still, I believe that parliamentary democracy only works if you can have some kind of a consensus. In Germany, in the United States, or everywhere. The 20th century has proved this, I think. And if the consensus vanishes in a crisis situation, whether in any nation, and especially in Germany, this fragile structure will collapse. It may not collapse into a dictatorship, it may collapse into something else.
Well, I was interested in hearing that you favor the coalition as it has formed. I was personally very much bothered by it, and primarily bothered by it for the reasons which were given for the coalition. The argument was that we face a crisis, and therefore we must have coalition government. And it seems to me that the crisis which Germany faced was not that serious. Certainly, it's a deep-seated economic problem which they do face, but the problem can get much more serious and much more severe. And it seems to me that a coalition government ought to be preserved for a major national crisis, so that in effect they have already shot their bolt. They have already applied the cure which they have, which the parliamentary system has for a crisis, namely the coalition. And what if the crisis deepens? They have no means by which they can strengthen their position short of going to more dictatorial powers.
But you see, in reality, I'm for it because the difference between the two political parties is meaningless. So two things might now happen. One is, as the difference between the political parties is meaningless, you might now, perhaps, possibly, get a meaningful opposition. That is, you might get a true socialist movement, let us say, instead of what the Social Democrats are, really a sort of another kind of liberal party is what they are. You might get a true socialist movement. You might get a true kind of opposition. And a parliamentary government may have more strength if there's a true opposition rather than a phony one.
Yes, but there is no indication, or at least I don't believe there is an indication at present, that a left or further left opposition party will form. If anything might form, I would almost believe that it would appear on the right.
There are some indications which are not discouraging. For example, the Socialist Student Organization, which is very large, was, as you know, expelled from the Social Democratic Party, and it might give hope for greater independence for the future. What gives one hope for greater independence for the future, perhaps in America as in Germany they have this in common, is the student movements. somehow in the West now the student movements have taken over as the opposition. After all, what opposition do we have in America? It's the students' movement, really, to our foreign policy, which is the core of it. And in Germany, it's the student movement, which is now the core of the opposition to the left.
Yes, this may be true, but on the other hand, as you pointed out in a different connection earlier, the left, or the student movement, is marked by a absence of organization.
And not so in Germany. Not so in here it is, yes. But in Germany it is quite tightly led. In fact, it tends really towards a kind of Leninism, at least in Berlin, as I happen to know. It is led.
But does it stand any chance against a much more rigid political system than we have? I mean, will a new party stand a chance of forming?
Well, that will have to be seen in the future.
Yes, this would be more difficult, I would think.
I'm just saying this is a possibility.
Yes, yes.
I agree with you that in a crisis it may well go right rather than left. At the moment, certainly the opposition is on the right in Parliament rather than on the left. On the other hand, you have potential strongmen already on the horizon. Now take Franz Josef Strauss, the present finance minister, the former defense minister, much disputed head of the Bavarian Christian Democratic Party. Franz Josef Strauss is certainly a strong man. He isn't as bad as people say he is. He isn't quite as nationalistic as people say. He's a very bright and, in fact, brilliant man. But he is a very strong man. He is playing to the nationalists. What you call dictatorial rule could easily come through Franz Josef Strauss becoming the chancellor on a strong Christian democratic resurgence. This would always make for a situation such as you describe, with the kind of emergency law, which they've never been able to pass, that is, laws giving the government actual emergency powers, that is, power over free speech and press, which the German parliament has refused to pass hitherto. Let me make another remark while I'm at it. Militarism, I do not think, is really a danger, because the German army is unique in the world now, the West German army. Not only, as you know, can trade unions organize soldiers in the barracks, not only do they have an ombudsman, that is somebody who is an intermediary between the soldier and parliament, but it is, in a way, oddly enough, after all of this, what's happened in the past, the most democratic army, the most civilian army, civilian-oriented army. This has been badly received by old-line officers. I don't think it has been badly received by the soldiers. Militarism, I think, is out.
You don't think this type of thing could be abolished in an hour or a day, then, huh?
Oh, that would be extremely difficult. I think extremely difficult to abolish something like that once you've introduced it. In theory, you can abolish anything.
One of the major safeguards, probably, against the reappearance, or certainly sudden reappearance, of militarism, is the military legal system, the court system, or I should say the absence. The military has no legal power, no court system at all. And every offense committed by a soldier, whether he's murdered a man, whether he's deserted, or whether he's come late in from his pass, is handled by civilian courts. There is no military justice.
So that I think the revival of militarism isn't so important.
No.
But to come back to our main subject, I do think that this party is not a Nazi party, but a conservative party, a rightist conservative party. I think it lacks the trapping of militarism, because that is no longer involved. The Nazis didn't have military support either at first, of course. It lacks, in many ways, the trappings of a mass movement. Its clientele is largely rural and small town, and again I must say this was true for the Nazis too at first. But there is built into this party a traditionalism, a conservatism, which I think, while traditionally German nationalist, is not as dynamic as National Socialism. And finally, let's be honest, what power does Germany still have? I like to annoy my German friends in saying you're about as important now as Romania was in the 30s. I mean, they will do what the big powers say in the end. They have really no alternative, and in this case I count France as one of the big powers. So I just do not see that Germany can be a menace anymore in the world.
But what? Go ahead, Rick.
Well, I was going to say the presence of Nazis in the current National Party, I think, is relatively insignificant in that we have to remember that National Socialism, to begin with, was a strong nationalist movement and had attracted many people who were strictly nationalists and who were not really National Socialists or fascists in the genuine sense. And these are the same people who now appear in this party.
Well, there's one more thing I think that must be said here. I would perhaps be more alarmed if Germany were united, but and I must say, thank God there is no hope of Germany being united again, I think the matter is not too serious.
Yeah, this was a question I was going to ask. You feel there's no chance of the East and West division ever?
I don't think anybody wants it. I think some Germans may want it, but by no means all. I think that it's to the interests of world peace to keep it disunited. A strong nation in Central Europe is always going to be, at the basis, a troublemaker. Can't help it by its very geographical situation. It has been my opinion that we should recognize East Germany as soon as possible. It's been that for a long time. But we do live as Americans in a world of never, never land. I mean, we don't recognize East Germany. China doesn't exist. We live in a fairy tale, a Western fairy tale. The world is not a Western fairy tale. So I think we should recognize East Germany as soon as possible. And then this danger, I think, will have vanished.
If your student groups, which you feel are the strength of socialism in West Germany, say they came to the fore and took over, would there then be a possibility of a combination?
Yes, there might be. But the two parts have grown too far apart in attitude, in economics, in every way. You think. It would be very difficult to do. Even if you could do it tomorrow, it would still be awfully difficult to do.
I agree with everything you said about German disunity and the need for it. But on the other hand, there's also the possibility, and we can't get into this unfortunately, that this would be a source of trouble and continued frustration to the Germans.
The fact that they
are disunited.
To the West more than to the East.
Yes, yes.
That is possible, yes.
They're talking about it, even though it's an unreal thing. They keep talking about it.
Yes, it's kept alive.
They talk themselves into a corner.
It's kept alive by politicians, just as the German ambitions to the East are kept alive by politicians.
But you feel this is strictly a lip service sort of thing?
Strictly lip service, there's no doubt about that.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have been discussing neo-Nazism in Germany and what it amounts to, if anything. Our panel members were Professor George L. Mossey of the University of Wisconsin, where he is Bascom Professor of History, Professor Fred Duman of the History Faculty of Washington State University. We'll be back next week at this time with another edition of Let's Talk About That.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. You've been listening to Let's Talk About That with Bert Harrison of WSU's Communications Faculty. Professor Harrison's guests today were Frederick Duman and George Mossey. Let's Talk About That is produced and transcribed by the Radio and Television Services of Washington State University.